Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this beautiful spring afternoon. I'm Maria Lipinski. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Communication and director of the Communication Arts and Sciences Health and Risk Communication Center here in the college. Also, I'm a faculty member in Michigan Ag Bio Research. The annual Bettinghaus lecture focuses on issues regarding health and risk communication. This lecture honors Erwin P. Bettinghaus, former professor in the Department of Communication, its chairperson and the Dean of Deans, as we call him, at Michigan State in this college for 20 years, from 1975 to 1995. Irv Bettinghaus played the initial key role in introducing communication research to the U.S. National Cancer Institute, and in so doing, since that time, NCI has been the largest institute in the National Institutes of Health. Irv's close involvement with NCI meant that the rest of NIH learned about communication research from him, too. This lecture series is made possible by an endowment gift from Irv and Kay Bettinghaus. We are honored today to have as our Bettinghaus Endowed Lecturer Dr. William Klein. He's the Associate Director of the Behavioral Research Program in the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences at the National Cancer Institute at NIH, where he has been since 2009. Dr. Klein received his MA and Ph.D. in social psychology at Princeton University and rose through the academic ranks at University of Pittsburgh primarily. Since that time, he has served in various leadership positions and held a number of different academic appointments. He's currently at NCI, but also serving as an adjunct at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and at University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Klein's research interest falls largely under the areas of self-judgment, risk perception, and risk communication. He's interested in how risk perception biases are related to the processing of health communication, information, and to health decision-makings and to health behavior. He also studies how social processes influence responses and personalized feedback function in response to risk communication. He's studied the influence of affective factors such as worry on risk appraisal and health decisions, the impact of ambiguity on responses to feedback and risk messages, and the role of optimism in health behavior and psychological functioning, and the application of theory to risk communication and health behavioral intervention. He has published over 150 papers in communication, psychology, and health journals on many issues that are germane to the research conducted by all of you and by others within the college. I've read much of his work throughout the years, but as I reviewed his vita for this talk, and we've had some funny conversations about how at the depth at which I reviewed his vita, I really had a great time learning about the whole breadth of his work and all the very interesting things that he's been doing through the years. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. William Klein and thank him for coming today.
Well, and thank you all for having me here. It's really a wonderful honor to be here to deliver the Bettinghaus lecture, and to meet all of you. I've met many of you personally over the course of the day, and that's been a lot of fun. And I want to start just by acknowledging Irving Bettinghaus, because I think that the impact that he had on NCI, which was just alluded to, is really quite profound. He was really one of the first communication researchers to have a dramatic, palpable impact on the kind of thinking that was happening at the National Cancer Institute. So he was interested in the effects of media on cancer risk perceptions. He was a member of our National Cancer Advisory Board, our NCAB, what we call them at NCI. That's kind of our board of trustees for NCI. He also really cared, and continues to care about integrating knowledge from university and government research to actual web-based education and programs that help prevent chronic disease. I mean, someone who really thought about the whole continuum from basic research to applied research. And also understood, I should say understands, because he's still around and still thinks this way, that persuasion should not be based on intuition. And when it does, it inevitably fails. And I think many people in this room know that if you just ask the average person on the street, how should we communicate about cancer risk? What you get may not match up with what the evidence shows us to be the best way to communicate. And he is someone who acknowledged that from the very beginning. All right, so I want to talk about risk communication, what it looks like to do good risk communication. And typically when you talk to the lay public and even researchers about risk communication, typically this might be one of the first things they think about, how to communicate numerical information. This is a table that's taken from one of my favorite papers. I assigned this paper in my graduate course on judgment and decision making by Angie Fagerlin and colleagues. And what it does is very systematically go through a number of clear recommendations for how to communicate risk. And they're all very good recommendations. But what I would say is that they're all really based on some of the cognitive limitations that people have in facing health information. So using plain language, presenting data using absolute risk, presenting data using frequencies. And it's all predicated on a lot of work done in decision science showing how people deal with numbers. So this looks like all the same thing to us as educated people, but it turns out that the average person in the United States thinks that these three numbers are different. They're not the same thing. For example, when faced with 10 out of 100, people think that something is more common than when faced with 1 out of 10 because they exhibit a numerator bias and focus more on the top of the fraction rather than the bottom of the fraction. 10%, people have no idea what 10% means. They have no idea what any percentage means. That's really a very complicated concept for people. And in fact, a lot of research in risk communication, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, say that you should focus on frequencies as opposed to percentages. And then you get research on risk pictographs, the idea that you should take risk and convey it in pictorial terms so that people can really understand it, because images speak louder than words, right? Or pictures speak louder than words. All of that is very important work. I've been part of it. I've contributed to it. I've read it. I've taught it. But it's not the whole picture. What I would say is that if we think about risk communication in its entirety, we need to be thinking about the whole human element. We need to think about everything that people are bringing to the equation. We certainly can focus on cognition, and that's where a lot of those recommendations are based, focused on literacy and numeracy and so on. We also, though, need to understand that people bring emotions to the table, and that's a completely different talk. I'm going to talk about motivation today, but I could also give a talk on how emotions really influence the way people think about and respond to risk information. And what I'm going to focus on today is motivation. What are the motives that people bring to the table when faced with risk communications in a whole variety of different contexts, whether it's a clinical context, a family context, getting online and filling out one of these risk calculators and getting feedback. All of those contexts involve communicating risk, but to people who have a variety of motives that affect how they process that information. So that essentially forms the outline of what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the motives that people bring to the table. And what I'll start with are some of the motives that decision science already has told us about over an extended period of time. And I'll talk about those fairly briefly just to give you a flavor. And then I'm going to spend the balance of my time talking about some of the work that I've been doing on self-related motives and social motives that are very important to acknowledge and understand when, again, comprehending how people really make sense of risk communications. So let's start with loss aversion, and this is probably going to be something that you've seen before or perhaps even talk about in your own work. And that's the idea that people are very averse to loss. We don't like to lose things. If you look at prospect theory developed by Kahneman and Tversky back in the 1970s, you can get a sense of how this works. So let's see if this pointer works. Yeah, so if you look on this side of the graph, this represents gains. And what this tells us is that the more you gain, the less appealing that gain is, right? So the first $10, that's pretty exciting. The next $10, a little less exciting. And then as you move along, it's diminishing returns, right? So if you already have $100, then giving you $10 more is not going to be as exciting than if you're starting with nothing and I give you $10. Nothing surprising about that. We also know, actually, that that happens down on this side of the graph with regard to losses. So the first $10 that you lose, that really stinks. The next $10, that stinks too. But as you kind of move along here, diminishing returns, right? So if you've already lost $100 and you lose 10 more, big whoop. That's not such a big deal. And so there's a sense in which there's not as much of an impact as things kind of move along in the curve. Very similar to lighting up a room, by the way. The first light bulb lights up the room. The second light bulb maybe lights it up a little more, right? Same idea. And psychophysics researchers have known this for years and talked about this for years. What's interesting about this graph, though, and again, many of you might be familiar with this, is that this part of the curve over here is steeper than this part of the curve. Essentially, people are more aversive to losses than they are attracted to gains. And as a result of that, because they like to avoid loss, they tend to take more risks when it comes to loss than when it comes to gains. So that has moved into the risk communication and health communication literature, that idea. And what many investigators are now arguing, and have argued for about 20 years now, is that the best way to get people to do things that involve some measure of risk is to focus on loss as opposed to focusing on gain. One example of that is screening. Cancer screening is a risky behavior. You can go in there and bad things can happen. You can get a perforated colon, for example. But perhaps more importantly...
I can interrupt you for a second.
Yes.
We got your wireless mouse on. It's distracting everybody.
Are we good?
There's a good Thank you.
Oh, okay. Should I start over?
No.
Irwin Bettinghaus, but no. So cancer screening is a very risky behavior in the sense that something bad can happen in the clinical setting, such as a perforated colon, but also, and perhaps more importantly, there's the risk of bad news. Nobody wants to get bad news. And so it turns out that there's some evidence that the best way to get people to do things like screening when there's some risk involved is to focus on a loss-based message as opposed to a gain-based message. So in other words, the losses of not screening as opposed to the gains of screening. We actually found that in a study that I did with some colleagues some years ago. And don't worry about the affective booster piece for now. I'll mention that in a moment. But just focus on the left side of this graph. These are people who are off schedule for colorectal screening in the Pittsburgh area. And we brought them in and we simply gave them a gain message or a loss message regarding colorectal cancer screening. And what we found, as you can see here, let's see if I do this right, what you can see here comparing these two is that a loss frame message led to higher intentions to screen than a gain frame message, and that's consistent with the literature. Now, what we also found here is that if you have people imagine the relief they're going to feel if they test for colon cancer and they don't have it, or if you have them imagine how bad it would be if they don't test and they turn out to get colon cancer, turns out that affective booster gets rid of the difference. And so when we gave people this affective booster, we diminished this gain-loss effect. And I mention this because it's important to note that framing effects happen, but they are moderated by lots of other things. In this case, emotion, but it could be moderated by other kinds of individual differences. The key thing here, though, is to understand that people are averse to losses, and that could drive the kinds of messages that we give them. Okay, so secondly, I want to talk about ambiguity aversion. And one of my favorite examples of this goes way back to Daniel Ellsberg, who was an economist and interested in decision making. And he developed what's called, the Ellsberg paradox. So imagine that you have two urns. Let me put this down. That's not the way to do it either. Okay. There we go. All right, imagine you have two urns. And you are going to randomly select a marble from one of these urns. All right, stick your arm in there, and you're not going to know what you're grabbing. You have to stick your arm in without looking. And what I tell you is that if you select a red marble, again randomly from the urn that you choose, you win $10,000. Okay? Now, the difference between these two urns is that urn A, you can see how many red marbles and black marbles there are in there. Urn B, you can't see it. It's covered, right? So you have to just kind of guess. An educated guess or an uneducated guess about what's in there. And so your choice is which of the two urns would you like to select from. When most people are asked to make this choice, they choose, what do you think? Urn A, right? Because urn A, you kind of know what you're getting yourself into, right? There's no ambiguity here. This is uncertainty about uncertainty, or what decision scientists would call second-order uncertainty. You don't really know what's going to happen when you stick your arm in there and pick out a marble, but at least you know what the probabilities are, right? So there's no uncertainty about the uncertainty. Whereas urn B is uncertainty about uncertainty. It's not even knowing what the probabilities are. And what's been found in the decision science literature is that people do not like urn B. They don't like ambiguity. They don't like uncertainty about uncertainty. And that has interesting implications for how to communicate risk, because we can't ever really tell someone that they have a precise risk of anything happening to them. We can't say you have a 56.3892 chance of getting breast cancer. That's impossible. We can estimate, but usually there's a margin of error, as we all know from statistics. And so to really communicate risk to people in a way that's consistent with the science, we should be giving them a range. We should say, based on your risk factors, family history, whatever, your risk of breast cancer is, 8% to 12%. But people don't want to hear that. They want to know, what's my risk? And so ambiguity aversion is a major issue that needs to be dealt with in the communication of risk. A third one is regret aversion. People do not like to experience regret. We just don't like to experience regret. It's a bad thing, and we do everything we can to avoid it. And so often people, when they're faced with risk information, will do everything they can to make decisions that will reduce the amount of regret they're going to feel later on, because people can anticipate how much regret they might feel. And there aren't any other species that can do that. You know, there aren't too many species who can even feel regret, for that matter, maybe none. But in terms of anticipating regret, that's something that's very human. And it turns out that that kind of anticipation of regret can drive our decision making. And I wanted to illustrate this with the game of blackjack, for those of you who are gamblers. So in blackjack, what you're doing is you're trying to get cards that add up to 21 without going over 21. When you go over 21, you bust, and that's it. You lose, okay? So you want to get as close as you possibly can to 21. So the dealer gives you these two cards, a jack and a 6. The jack is 10 points. So you now have 16 points, and you have to decide whether the dealer is going to hit you or not, which means giving you another card. Now, many people in this situation are starting to feel regret. Like, what if I have the dealer hit me and I get a 7? Well, then I'm going to bust. I'm going to go over the 21, and nobody wants to experience that. And so this is an unusual situation, and people have to decide what they're going to do and anticipate how they're going to feel if they do bust. And what you get is about 50-50. Some people will hit, some people will not. And what's important about this scenario is that it differentiates two different kinds of behaviors. One behavior is what we call an act of commission. It's committing something. It's doing something that can be regretful. And the other is an act of omission, or neglecting to do something. And in this case, if you hit, that's an act of commission, right? So you're taking the card, and you potentially are going to bust, and you're worried that you're going to bust, and so that gives you some anxiety and makes you hesitate. But what if we turn this around, actually, and we design the blackjack game such that it was a default to get hit? So you just sit there and you watch the cards come at you, and you don't tell the dealer what to do, right? Well, that exact experiment was done by a colleague of mine, and what he found is that it didn't matter whether people were getting the cards automatically or selecting the cards themselves. What mattered most is whether it was an act of commission or omission. When they actually had to do something, that inspired more anticipated regret than when they didn't have to do something. And that didn't have to do something could either be not taking a card or not stopping the dealer from giving them a card. Okay? So the bottom line here is that people are going to anticipate regret, and the way in which we communicate risk to them needs to acknowledge that, because we might communicate risk in such a way that will lead them to think, gee, if I do this or if I do that, I'm going to regret it. And again, a motive that we need to take into account. Lastly, from the decision science literature, I want to talk about the rational actor motive. So this is a motive that Eldar Shafir introduced back in the 90s. And the idea is that we all like to think of ourselves, we're all motivated to think of ourselves as rational actors, rational decision makers. We make informed decisions, we do the right thing, we're very careful, and so on. That's the way we like to see ourselves, and it's also the way we like other people to see us. So this is a social motive as well. The irony there is that that motive, to come across as a rational actor, can unwittingly make people make irrational decisions. Okay, so it's sort of a paradox. And let me show you an example of that. So imagine you're choosing between two drugs, and they vary on two dimensions that are equivalent in terms of importance to you. One, safety, and one, effectiveness. Okay? So you can see you've got X and Y. X is lower in safety and higher in effectiveness. And Y is higher in safety and lower in effectiveness. And again, remember, the assumption is that safety and effectiveness are equivalent in terms of importance. So you're now stuck. What do I do? Do I take the one that's more effective? Do I take the one that's safer? Well, what I could do in this scenario is I could add a third drug that's now very high in safety and very low in effectiveness. And when I do this, what do you think happens? What do people choose? They choose Y, right? Almost 90% of people choose Y. It has nothing to do with the safety and the efficacy or anything else about the choices that are being given here. What it has to do with is that people feel as if making a compromise is a rational thing to do. Right? And that's why this is called the compromise effect. When people are given 3 options, what they do is they pick the middle option because it feels right. And I find myself doing this sometimes. You go to the car dealership and you've got 2 cars, you can't decide between the 2. Car dealers know this, and so they might actually introduce a 3rd option, and you'll say, what the heck, I'll just take the one in the middle. So it's very easy to dupe people into doing this, to make a decision that is a compromise, which makes them feel as if they've made a rational, informed decision, when in fact it's really just an attempt at compromise. I don't think that's the most interesting example here. The most interesting one is the attraction effect. The attraction effect is somewhat like the compromise effect, but in this case what happens is you introduce a 3rd alternative, Z, which in the terms of decision science is dominated by the other 2. So look at what's happening with Z here. It's less safe and it's less effective, right? Nobody should ever choose Z. But what Z does is it causes you to choose Y because Y is so clearly better than Z. Okay, that's the attraction effect. It makes Y more attractive. And so again, if you're in a car dealership, the salesman might know this and might introduce a car that he or she knows you would never purchase, but makes the one that you were just looking at even more attractive. By the way, when I used to teach social psychology, I'd give an entire lecture on how to buy a car. And I put together a whole tip sheet for my students. And sometimes when they email years later, they don't tell me they liked my class or that it had anything to do with anything, but they tell me that tip sheet really helped them when they bought their car. And so this is one of many tricks that's used in a car dealership. Okay, so that's the rational actor motive. What I want to do with the balance of my time is build on this by talking about some of the more social psychological motives that I think need to come into play when thinking about risk communication. The decision science motives are very important. We need to take account of those, but they're not the only ones present. We also are living, human, breathing people who interact with others and care about how others think of us, and we also care about how we think about ourselves. And the motivations that are associated with that might be brought to bear in how people, how they respond to a risk communication. And I want to start with social comparison, which is something that's fascinated me since graduate school. And just to give you an example of the power of social comparison. Some years ago, Time magazine came out with this article on sex in America based on Kinsey data. And this is one of those things people don't know much about. You probably can get a sense of how often people smoke or how often people eat fatty foods because you see them doing it. You see them in restaurants, you see them in cafeterias. You are presumably not in other people's bedrooms, hopefully. So you don't really know. I mean, at the time this was done, many married couples had no idea how often other married couples were having sex, and they were really kind of curious. And so this report was really quite impactful. And the article itself was very interesting, but I think what I found most interesting is what happened a week later when there was a letter to the editor in Time magazine that really got at this notion of social comparison. So this guy in Minnesota, who I'd really like to give an honorary doctorate to in psychology or communication, we Americans are always trying to find out exactly what other people are doing in their lives in order to rate ourselves. And boy, is he right. There is an incredible amount of evidence there in the literature suggesting that we compare ourselves with others and that we care about the extent to which we compare well with others. And if you actually look at the evolutionary literature, it kind of makes sense. As some of us were discussing earlier today, if you're in a species that is being preyed upon by another species, it would probably help you to know where you are in terms of the hierarchy. Are you the strongest animal in the herd? Are you the weakest? Are you in the back? Are you in the front? That's a useful piece of knowledge to have, and that's all about social comparison. It's about knowing where you stand relative to others. There's a lot of evidence, actually, that social comparison is automatic and implicit, and we do it without even knowing that we're doing it. And so some early data in the 70s and 80s showed that high school girls, when they were exposed to pictures of models in magazines, they rated their own attractiveness lower. But in many cases, these studies were done in such a way that they didn't even know they'd seen the magazine advertisements. They were just shown as a blip on a screen for like 500 milliseconds, which is barely enough time to actually know what you've seen. And these girls were rating their attractiveness lower. And so it seems to be the case that we engage in these kinds of comparisons very quickly and in ways that we don't even know about. And that's really important to know, right? Because if it's that powerful, if it's that instinctual, then maybe we should pay attention to that in thinking about how people are going to respond to risk. Well, several years back, I decided to tried to pursue whether this interest in comparative information might be so powerful that it might even overwhelm or supersede the relevance of objective information in how people define themselves. So I did something very simple. I asked people to imagine that their risk of causing a car accident was either 30% or 60%. Okay, pretty easy. Just imagine your risk is 30% or that your risk is 60%. You would all agree, I'm sure, that you should be more worried if your risk is 60%, and you should feel less safe if your risk is 60%. But at the same time, this was a 2x2 design because I was trained in an experimental social psychology program where everything was a 2x2 design. And so the other variable was whether your risk was below average or above average. Okay, so your risk of 30% or your risk of 60% was either above the average for your age group, your gender, whatever, or below the average. And I asked people how safe they felt as drivers. And here's what we found. So this is how safe you are on the y-axis. Here we go, how safe on a 7-point scale. And what you can see is there's a difference here in terms of how safe people feel based on the condition that they're in. But perhaps most strikingly, if you compare this bar with this bar, these are people whose risk is 60% and below average, and these are people whose risk is 30% and above average. So these people felt safer, even though their risk was 60%, than these people whose risk was 30%. They didn't care what their risk was, 30, 60, who the heck cares? But my risk is above average? Oh no, right? That's really what drove people's judgments. And this is just a simple hypothetical vignette, but we have found this in many other studies, that people, when they feel as if their risk is above average, that means more to them than telling them what their numerical risk is. Now, we pursued this a little bit more and thought, gee, if people care about where they stand relative to others, maybe it doesn't even matter what we tell them. We can tell them their risk is below average or above average, but just having that comparison, having that context might be very impactful in terms of their behavior. So in work that I did with Isaac Lipkis at Duke University, we brought in people who were off schedule for colorectal cancer screening. And what we did is we gave them comparative information. We said, your risk of getting colon cancer is higher than average, your risk of colon cancer is lower than average, or a control group that didn't get that information at all. And by the way, this was real information. We didn't give them deceptive information. We told them what their real risk was, above or below average. And then we just looked to see whether they were interested in getting screened. And here's what we found, and we thought this was really dramatic. So the control group here, that's the red bar. The control group, those are folks who got nothing at all, just basic risk factors for colon cancer. The gray bar, these are people, sorry about this arrow, I'm not quite sure how to get rid of it.
There's a button on it, but I don't know which one it is. No, that's not it. I'm pushing right. I don't know.
That's okay. All right, we'll figure it out.
Dave, there's something.
All right, let's go backwards.
Dave's coming back.
Oh, good. So anyway, you can see the gray bar in both cases here. These are people who are told their risk is below average, so low comparative risk. And these are, the blue bars are people who are told their risk is high, higher than average. Notice there's no difference between the people who found out their risk was lower than average and the people who were told their risk is above average. I'm sorry, I'm a technological dinosaur.
It's this thing. It's kind of
Okay.
crazy. There we go.
All right, we're good to go?
Do you want the cursor or you don't want the cursor?
We'll just move
Let's
the
get the
cursor
cursor
right
away.
off the screen
Yeah,
here.
and so you can he'll only have the dot.
There.
All right,
Okay.
good.
Cool.
My daughters will be
Back
proud
on
of me.
again. If it comes back on again, it's this switch right here.
Okay, sounds good, thank you. Okay, so you can see that it doesn't matter what their risk is relative to others. What matters is they found out where they stood relative to others, and that motivated them to go get screened. And you might think, oh, what's going on here? And of course, we spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I think what we came to is if you find out your risk is higher than average, you think, crap, I should really go in and get tested. If you find out your risk is below average, you think, gee, that's reassuring. Now I can go in and get tested and not worry about it, right? So one way or the other, there's a good reason to go in and get tested, but it's because you found out what your comparative risk was. Okay, this has led to the development of risk engines that use comparative risk. And when I use the term risk engine, what I mean is one of these risk calculators where you go online, you plug in all your risk factors for a particular disease, and then it spits out some output and tells you what your risk is. And there are tons of these all over the web now, and many of you are in risk communication, so you probably have used them or seen them. This is one called Your Disease Risk, developed by Graham Colditz and colleagues. And you can see what people are told here is what their risk is relative to others. In this case, your risk is above average. And we've been using this risk engine in a number of studies to see what the effects are on a whole variety of different things. One example of that is work led by one of my postdocs, Stephanie Fowler, in which we found that if you give people comparative risk information about their breast cancer risk, what you see is they have higher intentions, higher self-efficacy, and higher response efficacy, all related to physical activity. So these are women who are told what their risk of breast cancer is, and we want to see if giving them their breast cancer risk information has any effect on physical activity. And on 3 different measures that are important proximal predictors of physical activity, we saw the difference. And so it seems like social comparison might be a very useful tool to get people to do good things, to change their health behaviors, and to understand the importance of their risk. And this is just sort of a sampling of the work we've done. In general, the power of social comparison is really much more than I ever would have expected, and it suggests that we need to pay attention to this motive that people have to pay attention to how they compare with others. So with that in mind, let's take it one step further. Yeah, we care about social comparison. We care about how we rate relative to others. But there's a little more to it than that. We don't just care about how we compare with others. We want to be better than them, right? There's a lot of evidence out there that people not only compare with others, but they compare with an agenda, with an ulterior motive, to be better than other people. And so a lot of evidence suggests that people think they are better than average on many dimensions. For those of you who are Garrison Keillor fans, and probably not anymore, but back in the day when he was highly regarded, and he did Lake Wobegon, you remember that Lake Wobegon, all the children are above average. And that's the idea here. We all think we're above average. One study showed that 97% of university and college professors think they're better than average teachers. 97%. And if you sign up to take the SATs as a high school student, you have to fill out a questionnaire, and you have to estimate your percentile rank on a bunch of different things. Inevitably, on everything, the average is 85%, 90%, 95%. Now, not all high school students take the SATs, so it's a biased sample. But still, among those individuals, they can't all be way up on the top of the distribution, right? There has to be an average in order for there to be a distribution. So you see this again and again and again. Another study showed that 90% of drivers think they're better than average drivers. So you think to yourself, well, yeah, I know accidents happen, but I don't need to worry because I'm one of those better than average drivers, right? And you get it on bizarre things like, to what extent do you think you can, fill in the blank, and you give people something they've never heard of. They still think they're better than average at it. So we have this sort of theory we go through the world with that we're better than other people. And maybe that's not such a bad thing, because if we didn't think we were better than other people, we might feel dejected and not try new things and so on. And there's some evidence of that in the psychological literature. Now this extends to risk. So people tend to be unrealistically optimistic about their future risk. And Neil Weinstein first discovered this in 1980. And he did it actually by accident. He was interested in asking people how much they were exposed to noise pollution in particular. And he wasn't sure how to ask them that, so he just devised this scale. Are you exposed to more noise than average, or less noise than average, or just the average amount of noise? And he just came up with this out of the blue. He was a physical chemist, not a psychologist or a behavioral scientist, and he just came up with this scale. And then he noticed that everybody thought they were exposed to less noise than everybody else. And it was a representative sample, so that can't be possible, right? There has to be an average. So he pursued it a bit further and found that, yeah, turns out that many of us think that we're less at risk than other people of experiencing a whole variety of different problems, particularly problems that are controllable, not things that are not controllable. Then we tend to be more pessimistic. But for things that we view as controllable, we tend to be somewhat unrealistically optimistic. And interestingly enough, these biases are associated with problematic beliefs and behaviors. Back in the day when I was at Colby College, my first job out of graduate school, I did a lot of work on alcohol use in college students. And what I found is that when students underestimated their chances of experiencing problems associated with alcohol use, they were more likely to experience those problems with alcohol use. So another paradox, right? They didn't think they were at risk, and not thinking they were at risk actually promoted more drinking and then more problems, and then it just became a vicious cycle. And so these kinds of biases potentially can be problematic, and that's important to understand when it comes to risk communication, because we might tell people they're at risk, and they might say, I don't believe you, because I don't think I'm as at risk as you think I am. So how should you address this? What should we do, particularly from a communication standpoint, to get around this unrealistic optimism and help people understand they might be at risk and they might need to do something about it? Well, one approach that we've been pursuing recently, and I've been excited about, is what we call proxy messages. The idea that we know that people are biased and defensive and unrealistically optimistic, but maybe the way to get to them is to go through someone else, as opposed to getting to them directly. So that's the idea of a proxy message. And instead of telling you that something you're doing is bad for your risk, how about telling your spouse or your close other or someone else who has some influence over you, and having that person try to do something about it, given the assumption, and a not so clear assumption, that that person is going to be less defensive and perhaps more responsive to the message. So what we did in this study, a series of studies, is we gave a message about the link between behavior and cancer risk to both men and women who are in relationships. But we varied it in such a way that the message that went to the men was about either the men or the women, and the message that went to the women was either about the women or the men. And just to make that a little clearer, so for men, we gave them an essay either about the link between obesity and prostate cancer risk, which clearly was relevant to them, or we gave them a message about the link between obesity and breast cancer risk, which was mostly related to their female spouses or female partners. Men can get breast cancer too, but that's a smaller proportion. For women, we did the same thing. They either got the message about obesity and prostate cancer risk, meaning it was relevant to their male partner, or we gave them the message about obesity and breast cancer risk, which of course is relevant to them. And then we simply just looked to see at how they responded to this message. And these are two of the measures that we used. One was how worried they would be about the content of the message, and then also whether they would be willing to talk to a provider. And I should say we also had a control group that got a message that was not at all related to either the men or the women. So it was just a message that was not threatening. And what you can see here, these are the red bars. The red bars are the control group, and so we're comparing everything to those. The gray bar are the folks who got messages that were related just to them, and the blue bars are the proxy messages, the messages that went to the partner, right? And what you can see here is that when it comes to worry, people who got the self message are no different than the control. So if you're a man getting the prostate cancer message or a woman getting the breast cancer message, you don't respond any differently than the control group, which is consistent with all the literature on defensiveness and unrealistic optimism that I talked about before. But you do get an effect over here for worry. What you see is that when people get a proxy message, their worry does go up. So when men got the breast cancer message and when women got the prostate cancer message, they were more receptive to it. They were more likely to worry about it. And you can see here, they're also more, they're more likely to talk to their provider or want to talk to their provider. So this is interesting, right? Because it suggests the best way to get to somebody is through their close other or through their spouse, through a partner. And that person might actually be able to do something to make behavior change happen. And that's not a new idea. That's been out there in the relationships literature and the health literature, but not necessarily from a communication standpoint. And so we're excited to try to follow this up. All right, so that's one approach, is to think about using proxy messages. A second possibility is to reduce the bias altogether. So let's just jump out there and get rid of unrealistic optimism, make people less biased. So Neil Weinstein, I mentioned him already, he and I back in the 90s, we decided we were going to do 4 or 5 studies to try to really reduce unrealistic optimism. First one, total miserable failure. Second one, even more miserable failure. Third one, miserable failure. Fourth one, miserable failure. Eventually, we sent the paper to Health Psychology, and the editor actually accepted it because he thought, wow, This is something that should happen. Unlike many of the hypotheses that we test where, we're not really sure, the kinds of things we did were just totally over the top. They should have changed people's risk perceptions. And not only did they fail, they made them worse. We actually made people more unrealistically optimistic. And the title of the paper ended up being Resistance to Changing Personal Risk Perceptions or something like that. But the initial title was Four Miserable Failures at Trying to Change Risk Perceptions, and the editor didn't like that title. And that was back in the day when null results were not published. Things have changed recently, but back in the day, that was a hard thing to do. But then I had this sort of serendipitous moment where I thought, wait a second, what are we doing here? Why are we trying to reduce unrealistic optimism when really what we should be doing is just reducing the effects of it? And that really became important when we started looking at data, national data that were longitudinal in scope, to look at the effects of unrealistic optimism over time. This is a complicated figure, but just to give you the bottom line, we looked at people over a 10-year period. We asked them at the beginning of that 10-year period, do you think you're going to get cancer? And then 10 years later, we asked them, did you get cancer? And all I'm showing here is the affective well-being and the life satisfaction of these people. And we can break them up into 4 groups. People who thought their risk was low of getting cancer, and then they got it. People who thought the risk was high of getting cancer, and then they got it. And then the other 2 groups, right? The people who thought the risk was low and didn't get it, the people who thought the risk was high and didn't get it. The people who were doing the worst here were the realists. The people who are doing the worst in terms of affect and life satisfaction are the ones who said, yep, it's going to happen to me, and then it happened to me. Then it happened, okay? Well, geez, if that's the case, then we shouldn't be getting rid of unrealistic optimism. And in fact, if you take a look at this closely, you'll see the people who didn't think it was going to happen to them, and then it happened to them, they're not doing that badly. And so maybe it's not a bad thing to walk through the world thinking that bad things are not going to happen to you. And Shelley Taylor, who's a health psychologist, argued this back in the 80s. She said these kinds of biases actually get us up in the morning. They help us survive, right? And so maybe getting rid of them is not the way to go. Maybe the way to deal with them is to try to reduce the effects of these biases. And that gets us to reducing the effects of the bias, and how should we do that? So what I'd like to talk about now is the idea of value affirmation. And this is a motive that's important, but also it's in a way of addressing some of these self-enhancement biases. And this comes out of work done by Claude Steele, a social psychologist, who argues that we have a very important motive to be seen by others and to see ourselves as having integrity, as having values that are consistent over time, and as having a connection to the world that's consistent, reliable, a relationship to the world such that we are having a positive impact on other people. I mean, that's what drives us, right? And in fact, some of the earliest studies were studies that looked at whether focusing on people's values can pull them away from feeling cognitive dissonance and make them less likely to do the kinds of things that had been shown in the social psychological literature to reduce dissonance. If you know this literature, you know Leon Festinger, a long time ago, would have people do things like they'd get paid a small amount of money to lie to another person to say that the experiment they were just in was really a lot of fun when it was not. Okay? And what happened is people would change their attitude and come to say or come to think that they liked the experiment because they couldn't justify lying to someone else for this piddly amount of money they were paid to do it. So that was a classic example of cognitive dissonance. And what Claude Steele showed is that all you have to do is have people focus on their values, and it gets rid of the need to resolve that dissonance because they have now come back to realizing why they like themselves, why they're important, what their values are. And so the dissonance, whatever, you can sort of push that aside. And this idea of value affirmation has pervaded multiple literatures now, and it's been used in many different ways to reduce defensiveness and get people to be more responsive to threatening information. Because again, if people can reaffirm their own values, it's easier to deal with threat. It's easier to deal with some of the threats that face us on a daily basis. I'll give you one example of this from my own work. We recruited undergraduate participants, and we gave them a message about the link between alcohol use and breast cancer. And by the way, I could give you a whole other talk about that. There's emerging evidence that alcohol is a significant risk factor for breast cancer, and it's something that is not being discussed in this country for lots of reasons, some of which you might be able to suspect. And yet it's something that we need to pay attention to because it's a significant risk factor. Anyhow, so we gave these students some information about the link between alcohol use and breast cancer risk. And we also look to see what their attitudes were about cancer messages. You can imagine a lot of people hear messages like that. Maybe you're feeling this right now. And they say, Jesus, everything causes cancer, right? I've heard this before. Apples cause cancer, they don't cause cancer. This protects cancer, this does not protect against cancer, whatever. And so people get kind of concerned and they just turn off and they don't want to know. And so we were able to divide up our students into those who perceived a high amount of ambiguity in cancer messages and those who perceived a low amount of ambiguity. And we used a measure taken from our Health Information National Trend Survey at NCI, which looks at perceived ambiguity about cancer messages. And what I'm showing you here is people's acceptance of the message about the link between alcohol and breast cancer risk. And what you can see is that among those people who perceived low ambiguity in cancer messages, so they were cool. They were not all that upset about ambiguity in cancer messages. Their acceptance of the message was the same, whether they were self-affirmed or not. But among those who perceived high ambiguity, these are the people who say, everything seems to cause cancer. I don't know what to do. Lots of ambiguous messages. Those are the people actually that often need to be targeted the most with cancer messages and other kinds of messages. And what we find is that if they were self-affirmed, they accepted the message more. And I should say, the way we self-affirmed them was very, very simple. All we did is have them write a one-page essay, and sometimes it was less than that, about a value that was important to them and how they had acted recently in a way consistent with that value. Very, very simple experimental manipulation. And it had this effect. And we see this kind of effect again and again in multiple different studies with all different kinds of threats. So let me now double back to the self-enhancement problem. I said we have people who are unrealistically optimistic. We want to get them to engage in healthy behaviors, but they're kind of defensive. Maybe we can use this self-affirmation technique to reduce the effects of unrealistic optimism. And that's exactly what we did in the next study I want to tell you about. Again, this is on colorectal cancer screening in Pittsburgh. So we recruited people who were unrealistically optimistic about the risk of getting colorectal cancer and also were off schedule for colorectal cancer screening. So these are people above the age of 50 who had not shown up yet to get their colorectal cancer screening test, which is usually a colonoscopy, not the most enjoyable test in the world, but something one has to do when one turns 50, and then after that every 10 years. And so we got these people in the laboratory and we asked them a bunch of questions, and then we looked to see what their intentions were to go and get screened. And then, of course, we followed them up later to see if they were screened. And there was some correlation between their intentions and their actual behavior, which I won't talk about here. What I simply want to show you is how our self-affirmation induction influenced their intentions to get screened. We had two control conditions. This condition here is a group that got social comparison information because I was interested in social comparison as well to see if that would have an effect. And these are people who got neither a self-affirmation or any social comparison information. And the difference here is negligible. There's nothing going on there. But what you can see here is that when people had an opportunity to self-affirm, they showed higher intentions to screen. And I want to point out, by the way, that we couldn't have these people sit down and write an essay. Many of them were not in a position to be able to do that. These were community residents, often low income, low education people in Pittsburgh, low socioeconomic status. And so asking them to write an essay was a significant burden for them. And so we actually had them tape their affirmations. They talked into a tape recorder and again talked about a value that mattered to them. And that alone seemed to have a significant effect on their intentions to get screened in the context, of course, of other information about colorectal cancer screening. So that suggests that self-affirmation might be a good thing in terms of making people more receptive to something that's threatening. So let's take this one step further. If we can do this in the laboratory, if we can make people self-affirm and focus on a value, what if it turns out that people just differ amongst themselves in the extent to which they do this in everyday life? All right, so if you're someone who, when something bad happens, you get a paper rejected, get a bad grade if you're a student, get insulted by somebody when they're not trying to insult you, whatever it might be. If what you find is that you respond to that by just thinking about your positive relationships with others or a value that's really important to you, then you would be high in self-affirmation tendencies. There are investigators who have developed scales to measure the tendency to self-affirm, the tendency to focus on one's values in the context of threat. So we were interested in looking at this in the context of genetic testing. we have access to a big sample at NIH of people who have come in and had their genome sequenced. So their entire genome has been sequenced, and the data will be used to look at some of the genetic predictors of heart disease. But fortunately, because there are some behavioral scientists at NIH who are involved in this, we were able to incorporate a bunch of behavioral measures into a baseline survey that all these participants completed at the time that they were having their genome sequenced. And because I was at the table, I was able to get some self-affirmation items in there, along with some other things as well, like risk perceptions. And then what we did is we looked to see whether self-affirmation played any role in people's interest in getting the results of their genome sequencing. And a key piece of this is that when you have your genome sequenced in a big sequencing trial, it's your choice whether you get the results back. Now, there's some debate about whether doctors are obligated to give you the results if it turns out you have the gene for Huntington disease or BRCA for breast cancer. I won't touch that right now. But for most of the results in this study, it was up to the participants whether they wanted to get them back or not. And for some people, that would be a useful thing to get because it could help them with family planning. It's information they could pass on to their families, to their children, and so on. And there's a big debate, of course, about the extent to which people should get genetic test results. Again, I'm going to put that to the side for the moment. What we looked at here in the analysis I'm going to show you is the extent to which self-affirmation played any role in people's tendencies to avoid threatening information. Because as I just argued, self-affirmation makes people less threatened. So if you present them with information that could be threatening, self-affirmation should soften that. It should make them less likely to be concerned about the impact of the information. All right, with all of that, what I'm showing you here is an interaction between information avoidance tendencies and individual differences in self-affirmation. Now, information avoidance tendencies, that's also an individual difference. James Shepard, one of my colleagues, developed a scale that measures people's disposition towards avoiding information. And we all avoid information all the time, but some people do it more than others, and some people are more likely to avoid threatening information than others. So that's what this scale measures. And as you can see, just looking at this, those who are higher in information avoidance tendencies, these parts of the lines are lower than these parts of the lines. So clearly people who are higher information avoidance are less likely to want to get their genomic results, because that's the dependent variable here, the y-axis, which is intentions to get your genomic results. But what you can also see here is that there's an interaction between information avoidance and self-affirmation. Namely, that people who are high in affirmation, people who can focus on their values in the context of threat, that bent the curve. It made people who are high in information avoidance less likely to want to avoid the genomic sequencing results. It's a lot of double negatives, so I know it's a little hard to understand. But the bottom line, the takeaway message is that self-affirmation can reduce the threat that people feel when faced with personal information that really can be very threatening to them. And genetic information, that's about as self-related as it gets, right? That's you. It defines who you are. And so it potentially is threatening. So we suggest that this kind of work is useful in trying to understand how self-affirmation can be measured and used in contexts where people are getting threatening health information. Okay, so I want to wind up by saying that I've talked about a number of different self and social motives here: self-affirmation or value affirmation, social comparison, and so forth, and all the decision science motives. But naturally, that's not the whole picture. There are many other motives that people bring to the table, and here are some examples. People really care about predictability, right? They like to know what's going to happen to them. And this leads to, in social psychology, we talk about the just world effect, that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. And that's why people who are victimized often get blamed, because it's easier for us to do that and think that the world is a predictable place and that bad things happen to bad people. There's a whole literature on that, and that's clearly a motive that people bring to the table when getting risk information. Control is a close relative of predictability. If I can predict something, I can also potentially control it, and people are motivated to control outcomes. And back in the 1970s, Ellen Langer showed that we have this illusion of control. We often think we can control things that really we can't control at all. But somehow, because we're motivated to think we can, that drives this illusion. It drives this sense that we can control things. We can also talk about promotion and prevention motives. Turns out that some people want to be healthy because they want to be vital and they want to have energy and they want to succeed and run in marathons. Other people want to be healthy because they just don't want to get sick, right? And that's a prevention motive. And there's a whole literature looking at how that difference might have an impact on the best kinds of messages one can deliver to people to try to get them to act in a healthy way. So I've just danced through these very quickly, but it's just to give you a flavor that there are other motives out there. But I think the more important thing is to understand that all of these motives matter when designing risk communications. We can't just focus on, should we use percentages and frequencies? We need to acknowledge that the person sitting in front of us, or the person who's using one of these risk calculators that we've designed, that person is bringing all of these motivations to the table, which can color the way in which they are processing that information. Another important thing to say here is that what I've said is not just relevant to the kinds of outcomes that I've discussed and that we focused on in our science, but to many different kinds of health communications. An example of this is warning labels. At NCI, we talk a lot about the use of graphic warning labels on cigarette packs, and I can tell you that there's a small number of researchers who have used some of the kinds of concepts I've talked about here in the context of graphic warning labels. So, for example, colleague Peter Harris at the University of Sussex has used self-affirmation to reduce resistance to warning labels in smokers, and it's worked quite well. It makes smokers less defensive when seeing those warning labels. So I encourage you to think about all the different kinds of health communications that you design and work on, and think about whether affirmation and other kinds of motives that we've talked about here could soften people's defensive responses to those communications. And lastly, if anything, I think all of this suggests that we need to do a much better job. And this is a message that I think I've heard a few times today and I've also conveyed a few times today, that we need to integrate decision science, motivational science, and health communication research much more closely. Decision science is often done by cognitive psychologists, cognitive scientists, often neuroscientists. Motivational science tends to be done more by social psychologists, and health communication tends to be done by people in communication. And those three groups, even though they're talking about a lot of the same things, as many of you know, don't often go to the same conferences or publish in the same journals, or talk to each other. And I'm someone who does appreciate that, in part because of my job at NCI, but I see lots of folks out there who just don't even have the opportunity to engage in that kind of dialogue. But to the extent that we can encourage that dialogue, I think we can get a more holistic view of how to design communications that are effective. So let me just end by thanking the funders of a lot of this research, National Cancer Institute, which funded some of this work before I worked for the National Cancer Institute, the National Science Foundation, the Prevent Cancer Foundation, and here are some principal collaborators. I do want to make sure to just tell you that we have a newsletter and a Twitter feed in our program at the National Cancer Institute. So if you're interested in learning more about the National Cancer Institute and priorities in terms of behavioral and communication research, this is definitely a place to go. So I encourage you to do that. And I will stop there and take any questions you might have.
Go back to the proxy message, and why would you think that proxy messages are likely to be more effective than from a source with whom they're unfamiliar?
Well, I think the idea is a proxy message is not going to evoke the same kind of defensiveness, and that's what we saw here. And so what we hope is that the person who's getting that proxy message is then going to follow through and do something like try to persuade the partner to do whatever it is that needs to be done. I should tell you, by the way, in that same study, we asked people about their intentions to either change their behavior or intentions to confront their partner about obesity. And of course, we should have predicted this all along. People had no interest in confronting their partner. So they had much higher intentions of doing something about their own, and by the way, all the participants were overweight, I should have said that. They had much more interest in doing something about their own overweight status than about their partners, because it's just too awkward, too difficult to talk to one's partner. But what we did find is when we asked them about things they could do to address their own risk or their partner's risk, they had a whole slew of ideas that did not involve confrontation, like purchasing healthier foods at the supermarket, or inviting them to go to a salad place for lunch, or talking to their provider, which is one of our dependent variables. So the proxy ends up being someone who can engage in behaviors that can reduce the partner's risk. That's the idea.
Let me ask you to engage in a thought experiment with me. Mm-hmm. Let's suppose that you're a woman whose husband works at DuPont, and he's worked in asbestos for years. And he comes home and he's hacking all the time because his lungs, because he has asbestosis. And let's suppose that you try to convince him to quit that job. Another way of looking at what you're doing is you're putting him in a counter-attitudinal advocacy experiment, likely making his attitudes more positive toward DuPont.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. I mean, every context is different, and what we were doing is focusing on a health behavior. And of course, there are many reasons why somebody is working in a particular institution or for a particular company and would face many negative consequences if they stopped doing that. We were in a situation where we were looking at a health behavior that clearly is going to reduce risk, right? So I think you're right. I think there are many contexts in which proxy messages are not going to work, and you need to take all the contextual factors into account. I'm not sure what to suggest in that particular context, because that's going to be a difficult one. You're right, you're going to get counter-attitudinal defensive responding in that context, probably more so than in the one that I talked about.
Can I just push you a little bit on that?
Yeah.
You use the word defense a lot. Is that really defense? In the following sense, suppose you're the male and you've got at best a high school education, and this is the way you provide and protect your family, and this is the only way you can do it. And perhaps that's a value trade-off you're making.
Yeah, I see your point. When I think about defensive responding, I think about the ways in which people like Amy McQueen and others have measured defensive responding, which is often developing new beliefs, new attitudes, changing one's attitudes in such a way as to make the message less threatening. So if you're a smoker and I tell you that smoking causes lung cancer, which most people know, and then you say, well, yeah, but vitamins can undo the effects of smoking. I would say that's a defensive response, because that's not true. Vitamins do not undo the effects of smoking. But in the context where your response is, there's another value that's more important, you're right, that's less defensive. That's more focusing on trying to reconcile values that are competing. And in that case, it's probably a subjective judgment of whether it's defensive or not. Defensiveness, in my view, and the way we talk about it, is developing inaccurate beliefs or drawing on inaccurate beliefs to try to justify behavior in the context of a threatening message. So it might be more of a terminology thing. Yeah.
Can I know what's your purpose to giving this speech? Do you just want to share us some interesting social psychology knowledge?
Say again.
What's the purpose? Why you give this speech?
What is the purpose of giving this talk? Well, I was invited to. And
For your entertainment.
but I really enjoy actually visiting universities around the country and talking to faculty and students. And I actually really enjoy coming to places where people are interdisciplinary and very engaged and enjoy thinking across disciplinary lines. And this is clearly one of those places. So when I get invitations from places, I often look to see whether this is going to be an audience that's receptive to thinking in an interdisciplinary way, and this is clearly one of those. So I was happy to do it and thought it was a big honor to come and speak as part of this Bettinghaus lecture series. Did that answer your question?
Do you think you really helped us, or you just try your best?
You're going to have to tell me that. I don't know. I mean, anytime I hear a talk on a topic I know something about, I usually learn something I hadn't heard before. And so I hope for those of you who know this literature, maybe there's a morsel in there, some nugget that you haven't heard before, and that might lead to a research idea or a collaboration. If so, that's great. If you've heard all of this before, God bless you. You probably can do a better job than I can at doing this work. And I'd love to hear about the work that you're doing, and that would be great. Yeah.
I wonder if there's been, I mean, obviously self-affirmation can be very powerful for decreasing defensive process, and it's been demonstrated over and over again. But when we do it in the lab, it's always, self-affirmation is difficult to do. It's always a very small effect size that you get. Has there been work on how to do it more effectively and more naturalistic contexts?
Yeah, there's a lot of work going on now on self-affirmation. Some of it is looking at different ways of manipulating it in such a way that it is more impactful. And some of it is just looking at what is it doing? What exactly is self-affirmation? Is it bringing people's values online? Is it simply making the self more activated? We did a study actually where we had people read an essay and circle the letter I whenever it showed up in the essay. And in social psychology, that's been shown to prime the self, because you're circling the letter I, right? And we found that was almost as effective as writing an essay about a value, which, then it starts making you wonder, okay, what's really going on here?
See what self-efficacy was. Again, the notion is if we're making the self-affirmed, am I going to perceive myself also as higher in efficacy,
Yeah.
and hence more able to engage in healthy behavior. But we're just having so much difficulty getting to that manipulation.
Yeah, and I think part of the issue, and we've been talking about this quite a bit, I think part of the issue is that just throwing self-affirmation out there and expecting it to have an effect under all conditions is probably misguided. There probably needs to be a set of conditions that are in place. One of them, for example, is that threat should be present. And what we find is that if we do a study where we self-affirm people prior to a threatening message, and many of them are not threatened by the message, it just washes out the effects, and then it looks like it's not an effective manipulation. That's one. A second is, and Rebecca Ferrer.
It's very curious to me because our experience in my lab has been just the opposite. That
Oh,
we
is
get
it? Okay.
self-affirmation actually much easier when they're not threatened, when we're just dealing with natural, everyday stressors, than when we threaten them with a message.
Yeah, and it turns out there might be some happy medium in there.
Yeah, no, I mean,
so
yeah,
we did,
very well, we went overboard with the threatening message.
Right, we did a self-affirmation study on that alcohol breast cancer story, and we found that the heavy drinkers, they couldn't care less. It had no effect whatsoever. The moderate drinkers is where the effect was, and the light drinkers, no effect. So there was sort of this happy medium, and where is that happy medium in any given study?
Well,
That's
that might be, going back to like Fazio and Cooper's work, it might be where is it falling in the latitude of acceptance, rejection?
Exactly, that's right. That's a good way to think about it. Another factor, by the way, and Rebecca Ferrer and Jeff Cohen have talked about this, is if you self-affirm people in the context of threat, and you're in a situation where there's a transition, where they can actually change something, it's going to be more effective. And so Jeff Cohen does all this work on self-affirmation in educational contexts, and he shows that when you have minority students focus on a value on the first day of school, they actually do better over the course of the semester than students who don't have that induction, suggesting there's an iterative effect of doing this value.
So that's cool, 'cause I'm-
Yeah, Jeffrey Cohen at Stanford. Yeah, and he and Rebecca Ferrer have written this paper, which is going to come out soon in Personality and Social Psychology Review, in which they detail what they consider some of the key conditions to be present for a self-affirmation to be effective. And those are two of them. I can't remember what the other ones are. So that'd be worth taking a look at when it comes out.
I mean, ship out an email.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wonder how researchers can practically utilize self-affirmation as an intervention in the mass communication campaign, because in the real world, it's really hard that before you give them the PSA and then ask them to recall what is the important value that you have in your mind, you will ask them to write in PSA. So I just wonder about that.
Yeah, there have been several folks who have been thinking about this and trying things, not successfully so far. But there's got to be a way to prime affirmation in a way that's fairly subtle and fairly easy and inexpensive that does not involve writing essays. One paper that I reviewed, one paper that I reviewed, what they tried to do is they showed smiling faces in a picture, predicated on the idea that when you ask people to write an essay about a value that matters to them, 75% of the time, in most studies, they choose relationships. And they talk about why it's important for them to be a good partner to their friend or to their spouse or whatever. So clearly relationships matter to people. So if you can somehow prime relationships by showing smiling faces or showing you interacting with other people or showing the effects of something you've done on another person's success, that might activate the same kinds of things that writing an essay does. And I reviewed this paper and it didn't work out very well. So it was I think, a nice college try. But I think there's more to be done there, and I think it's possible. We just don't know yet what that looks like. And by the way, in healthcare settings, it's not that hard to do the value affirmation. You don't even have to have people write an essay. I've seen other manipulations where people just fill out a value scale, and what that does is it just reminds them of what their values are, and that's all you need to do. And so if it's that easy, then it could be done in a setting where people are filling out a questionnaire in advance.
Thank you very much. Great talk. I was very interested in what you said about Peter Harris with the work on graphic warning labels and using self-affirmation in that context. Now, the reason why I was interested in that is that I once worked at the T course at the Tobacco Center of Regulatory Science, and there we got, within that interdisciplinary approach, we got a lot of legal training about what's possible at all. What will the legal people let you do in terms of the truthfulness of the pictures that are being shown and so on. And I was wondering if you could comment to the extent that this is your expertise about whether it's even possible to put positive messages within the graphic warning labels.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So for those of you who don't know the history, you might know that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, developed warning labels, graphic warning labels, to put on cigarette packages, and they didn't get through the courts. The tobacco industry sued, and they won, and those labels never appeared. They're out there, you can find them, and I can tell you there are many investigators who have done litanies, of studies with those labels, but they never made it. And one thing that the court said is that these labels were not informational, and that we shouldn't be putting anything on a product that's not informational, that's simply going to evoke disgust and fear and emotions. But interestingly enough, there's research in the affective science literature, people who study affect and emotion, suggesting that affect is information. That when people feel badly, I mean, think about disgust. From an evolutionary standpoint, you're disgusted by something for a damn good reason, right? You shouldn't eat it. You shouldn't confront it because it might make you sick, it might kill you. That's useful information. And so what has been argued in the literature is that we need to sort of reframe this and not say that graphic warning labels scare people, but rather that they're providing a useful piece of information that people can deal with. They can confront, they can understand, comprehend, and that can have an impact on their behavior. Now you're asking a somewhat different question, which is how can we make those labels be more positive? And I don't know if we're going to get there. What I can tell you is that one of the 9 labels that the FDA put forward was a positive label. It was this guy who said something about quitting. I can't remember what his shirt said, but it was a positive message about promoting quitting. And I have some colleagues who have done research on the 9 labels, and that was the worst one in terms of impact. So hard to know whether positive messages in that particular context are going to be as impactful as negative messages. In smoking cessation research, it has been shown that positive messages work. And one of my colleagues at the National Cancer Institute, Eric Augustin, handles a smoke-free text program or app in which people get texts that are very positive, very self-promoting, and help them deal with relapse, help them deal with cravings, and it's an enormously successful program. So there is something to be said for positive messages, but in terms of warning labels, I'm not sure if it's going to work or not. I think the jury is out. Sure.
What gets me with that, though, is that, and this is one of the things we've argued before, and I know of at least one study that's looked at this, what we tell smokers constantly is you can't quit. I mean, one of the big campaigns against starting to smoke is that it's addictive. So we essentially set up a context where self-efficacy is gone. And so a positive message of a guy saying, I quit, were opposed to a campaign. And I remember seeing someplace a study that looked at this where half of all smokers are former smokers. Gave people efficacy. But yet you could think about that as a positive message. I just think that in the context, the larger cultural context, that positive message is going to work because of the larger messages that the public health community is giving.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And it strikes me that the Food and Drug Administration is doing the right thing in their most recent campaign, because what they're doing in their most recent campaign is focusing not on quitting versus not quitting, but sticking to it and quitting again and again and again. And if the message is that this is not a one-time thing, you got to keep trying. That's the slogan, is keep trying, right? And if that's the message, then I think that offsets this idea or this messaging that they're getting that it's a lifetime thing and there's nothing you can do about it. And the Food and Drug Administration, by the way, is very hooked into the behavioral science literature. Many of the folks in the Center for Tobacco Products in the Food and Drug Administration have done cancer research. Many of them were fellows with us, postdoctoral fellows. So they're linked into the communication literature, the behavioral science literature, and they are, and we're not allowed to know this, so we don't know the details, what's happening. But they are working on a new set of labels that are predicated on getting past the concerns that the courts had and build on the existing literature. And let's see what they come out with.
One more question. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wanted to thank you because I've collected smoking prevention data in China, and we used gain and loss messages. And the loss messages, did a nosedive and bombed. And after your talk today, I think I understand a little better why that might might be the case, so thank you.
Sure, no problem. A lot of health behaviors like smoking or non-health behaviors like smoking, physical activity, vitamin use, exercise, tend to benefit more from gain frame messages than loss frame messages. The literature on that is a little mixed. The effect sizes are modest, but it's like self-affirmation. There are other contextual variables that need to be taken into account, and if you can nail those down, then the gain-loss difference can get bigger.
All right, well, thank you.
All right.
And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm sure you could take some more questions if you wanted to come up here, so.